in the world. This week has the ambitious title of Effective Policy Communication. Your cohort are the very first year to have this topic inserted into the program. Do you feel special? Yeah, very special. And there are two reasons why we've decided to insert this topic into the program this year. The first is from feedback last year. Last year we asked students to write 2 op-eds and a short policy report. And after we'd already received in their first op-eds, how will we describe it? What word would I use? Dismal? Terrible? But they weren't good, okay? And so we went into the tutorials after we received up the very first op-eds, and we said, guys, you either wrote more like a blog style opinion piece, very informal, very colloquial. This is not really what we were looking for. Or the vast majority just wrote a short essay. And we said, guys, what are we doing? And the students replied, Adam, you're an idiot. You're an idiot because of course we did. By this stage in academic careers, we're very good at writing essays. That's what we do. We are essay producing machines. We can pump these puppies out. Yeah, you ask us to write something, we're going to write you a very good essay very quickly. We don't know how to write op-eds. No one's ever showed us. Fair enough. Okay. So we then spent the next 2 weeks in the tutorials working through what an op-ed is, what it tries to achieve, style, technique, how much research, how you define things, all these things that you need to know. We then received in their second op-eds, and they were very, very good. Yeah? To the point where some of the better ones, we were encouraging students to send them out and try to get them published somewhere. They were that good. Okay? So, we're responsive to student feedback. Adam, you're an idiot. And so we've decided to insert this into the program this year before your first op-ed is due and not after it. Okay? So when it comes time for the student evaluations end of the semester, here's your lecturer responsive to student feedback. Remember this. Right? The second reason why this is we inserted this into the lecture program this semester is because of what we were going through in the very first week. There are 2 real aims to this course. The first is to get behind the scenes of what's currently going on. So right now in South Korea there's a nuclear summit. And in a few weeks' time we're going to be talking about nuclear proliferation, and we're going to be talking about rogue states and all that good stuff. And hopefully this will give you some sort of insight into what's going on right now in the world and the United States' place in the world. However, these things have a short lifespan. So next week we're going to be covering Afghanistan, which is going to be really cool. But in 2014, the United States is going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan, and this lecture may not have as much use for you from 2014 onwards than it otherwise would. And you're paying good money to be here right now, and so I wanted to give you something which is going to be more enduring, something that's going to stay with you for longer. And probably the best thing we can do for you is to give you some skills that are going to be useful for you in the future. And one of them is writing op-eds, opinion pieces, and policy reports. I think that most people here won't go on to become academics, and so although you are very good now at writing essays, it's probably this style of writing you're least likely to use in your future careers. When you go and you become bureaucrats down in Canberra, you go off and become leaders of industry, you go on and do great and wonderful things, you're far more likely in the future to be writing opinion pieces and policy reports than you are to be writing in an essay format. Yeah? Agree? So hopefully in this course, this is going to be more of an enduring takeaway of this course. Yeah? So the content, hopefully you'll find interesting, but the skills that you gain over the course of this semester will hopefully stay with you for longer and be useful for you for longer. That's why this is here. All right, so I could get up here now and talk to you about op-ed writing, or I could bring forward a very good friend and colleague of mine, Tom Switzer, who used to be the editor of the opinion pages for the Australian newspaper, which for our international guests is the national newspaper. He's now currently the editor of The Spectator. He's former senior advisor to Brennan Nelson. You probably know him best from his frequent appearances on Q&A and other media he's been doing. And Tom's also had his own pieces appearing in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, you name it, he's been there. Tom's the guy that teaches me how to write opinion pieces. Yeah? So we'll bring him now forward, and hopefully he's now going to spend the next, if you can hear me, he's going to spend the next half hour, 40 minutes running through how to write an op-ed, skill and the skills you need to write an op-ed. I'll then come forward and we can have a bit of a discussion, and the final half an hour, as always, you'll have time to take shots at him if you wish. You can ask him, I encourage you to ask him questions about not just opinion piece writing, but if you want to get behind the news and ask him questions about, well, how are opinion pieces selected to go into a newspaper? What's the process from the former editor of the opinion pages? How does this process all work? If you want to ask him questions about that, I'm sure he'll be more than happy to answer your questions. That's it for me. Hand over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Adam, and great to be back. I actually taught this class the last 2 years, and I enjoyed it very much. And I hope you're getting some real intellectual stimulation from some of your guests. Thanks for reminding everyone I worked for Brennan Nelson. It was the biggest mistake I ever made. I had 10 years working as an opinion editor for the Australian newspaper, more or less, which I think is fair to say is, you know, the leading op-ed page in the country, sort of back and forth between the Age in Melbourne and the Sydney Morning Herald. But it was a good job and I enjoyed it very much, and I was looked after, but I thought I'd make a punt after John Howard's election loss in 2007. I thought I'd do what my wife had been doing when she worked for senior Liberal ministers, and I thought I'd work for the Liberal Party. And I'll never forget my first day of work. It was on a Tuesday in early March of 2008. And the front page of the Australian newspaper, where I've been working for the previous decade, had a news poll saying Mr. Unpopularity, the most unpopular leader ever in Australian history, Mr. 9%. And I thought, well, it can only go up now, I'm here. And of course, 2 weeks later, because you know these news polls are relentless, they come out every fortnight. And this was at the height of Kevin Rudd's time in the political stratosphere. And the next news poll 2 weeks later said, new record low, Mr. 7%. And all my friends from Fairfax and the ABC and News Limited called me up and texted me and they said, Tom, what a terrible decision you made. This guy's on his last legs already, you've only been there for a few weeks. You must be depressed, demoralised, down and out. How do you feel? And I said, this is nothing. I've been a South Sydney Rugby League fan all my life. I can cope with anything. But no, I had a great time at the Australian and the Financial Review. For those who don't know, the two major publishers in Australia, Fairfax, publish the Sydney Morning Herald, the Melbourne Age, and the Financial Review, where I worked for several years. And then, of course, News Limited, or News Corp, which is Rupert Murdoch's papers, published mainly the tabloids, the Courier Mail in Brisbane, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, the Herald Sun in Melbourne, the Adelaide Advertiser, and of course the Australian is the only broadsheet newspaper. And I'll never forget, you know, now and again I'd often get these complaints from disgruntled readers saying that the opinion page articles that we published, God forbid, were biased. This is outrageous. You know, journalism, good objective journalism, fair and balanced journalism is missing on the opinion page. To which I pleaded guilty. Of course the opinion page articles would be biased, or they present a point of view, or make an argument, or reflect a school of thought. That's the whole idea of an opinion piece. Now I know some of you, quite understandably, because you're young and you're still trying to work out the issues of the day, and it's hard to be assertive when you're still learning so much. But the key criteria in writing these opinion pieces key effective quality is strength of argument. You've got to put forward an argument, but you've got to make it a strong one that sounds not just in style, but in substance. A sloppily constructed article, poorly worded piece will convince no one. But a tightly argued piece that sound in not just style but substance, as I say, those kind of articles will sway opinion. And that's why opinion articles are what many people would say are the intellectual ammunition in the battle of ideas. I think what distinguishes Australia from, say, the United States when it comes to opinion pages is that because Australia is a relatively speaking, small country, our population is 22 million, the United States is more than 300 million, the opportunities available are very limited. So I think in the public debate, particularly for academics and columnists, you're more likely to get more prominence on opinion pages of newspapers in Australia than you would in the United States. Because in the United States, yes, you've got the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, but they also have prominent political magazines that are centuries old, or nearly centuries old. The New Republic, The Nation, more recently Slate, Huffington Post tend to take a more centre-left, left-liberal persuasion. Whereas National Review magazine, or the Weekly Standard, or the American Conservative, as the name suggests, take a more centre-right position. So there's far more opportunities available in America. And for what it's worth, I don't know if this has been mentioned, but I think the best website you could possibly read while you're doing this course is realclearpolitics.com. Some of you probably no doubt do. It's realclearpolitics.com. And it's basically run by two guys, and they just pick the best, and what they think, and they're pretty good judges, the best and the brightest of the breaking opinion commentary, mainly in America, but sometimes in other parts of the world, including Australia. But it's mainly about American politics and American foreign policy. And they're always sharp, sound writers who appear on this website, and it's highly recommended. Okay, now let's get started with this. I've never done this before, so I hope this makes sense. Now I'm just going to be... Okay, now we all know about our opinion pieces. I've been told it's about 750 to 900 words, and you've got the rest there for footnotes and bibliography. Now obviously with an op-ed you don't want to have too many footnotes and too much bibliography because it's a short, sharp piece, it's only a short piece, so there's no need to cram too much, but I would encourage probably the standard footnoting would be maybe, or bibliography, 3, maybe 4 sources at most. I don't think you need to go overkill. I think you save that for your major essay in a couple of months' time. Writing style. Now this is just very general before I talk about the structure. I think it's so easy to get bogged down in Olympian language and bureaucratic jargon. And there's a very good book by Paul Keating, the former Labor Prime Minister's speechwriter, named Don Watson. He's a beautiful writer, and his book's called Death Sentence. I suspect you can get it at Fisher, but it's a very good book. We published extracts in the Australian when it was released about 5-6 years ago. And basically what he does is he looks at all these public relations statements put out by Qantas, Telstra, you name it. And the jargon is impenetrable. And over the years, especially when I worked at the Financial Review, when I'd receive articles written by PR flacks for business people and business leaders, I'd invariably get these long-winded sentences. And there's a danger because you get so consumed by your subject matter and all the articles and books that you're reading, you tend to lose focus of just trying to keep it simple and coherent. So here's a classic case in point. As part of the electronic delivery strategy, the vision to enable customers to transact low-value, commoditised financial market instruments electronically and seamlessly. Now, what does that mean? You just want to, that the electronic delivery strategy makes it possible to deliver things electronically? You've just got to go back and just clean it up and make it a simple sentence, which is, customers will be able to transfer money by electronic means for a reasonable price. You just got to keep it simple. And you might think I mean, admittedly, there is a different discipline to writing a major essay, and we'll talk about the distinctions later on. But particularly when you read these long-winded policy articles in journals, the style of writing is completely different to an opinion piece. The key is to keep it simple, because you're talking to a general audience, and they're the people you're trying to sway. It's a bit like a politician trying to sway the voter, although more these days they do it in a very crude manner. But you want to elevate the tone, but you want to make it in simple terms. Think of yourself as a lawyer. Many of you are studying to be lawyers. You're in a court of law, you're trying to influence the jury, talk in simple terms, and present valid evidence to support your claim. Some more examples. Both oil and high-tech industries are characterised by leader and laggard companies in terms of environmental performance. Why not instead just say, in both oil, high-tech sectors, there are companies that lead on the environment and companies that lag behind? You know, it's a classic case here. This was one of my favourite ones. I think I picked this up in an article. The US was an early leader in the area of information disclosure, and in terms of government information remains far more transparent than many European countries. Which is, you know, there's a term of, this is editing, you just try to keep simplifying it until you get it down to a simple thing where you say, US governments are still far more transparent than many European countries. And then you can even go further. The US was an early leader, information disclosure, and US governments continue to disclose much more than European countries. So again, it's just all about the key and keeping it simple. Now, as an opinion editor, you get so many submissions. Sometimes I get 50 articles a day, and you have to choose. You know, you don't have room for 2 or 3 articles on your opinion page. It's the same principle. I always used to say to them, grab me. You've got to grab my attention. You need a good introduction that will really work. And as I say there, you must signal that your topic is an interesting one, and you have something novel to say about it. And, you know, obviously for your essays this isn't so important, but in a general sense, the key to publishing is topicality. Try to peg your article to the news of the day, or the news of the week. Especially in this 24/7 relentless news cycle, it's so important to be on the pace, as we used to say. Again, more about the structure. Your reader should have a general idea of where you are going. For example, we explain this in the case study later on that Adam will give you. Your main argument followed by, you know, a few subpoints. Because you've only got 750 words, you want to keep it short and sharp. You have your thesis, your main argument, and support it with 3 other subpoints, just to keep it simple. You make one argument thoroughly, point by point. The more substance, the better. But if you try to do too much and go off in tangents, you can wind up with an article that, in striving to say everything, ends up saying nothing. You know, John Howard, when he wrote his best-selling memoirs that were published about 18 months ago, he originally wrote 2,000 words. Sorry, no, 200,000 words. Hang on. 2,000 pages, that's right. He wrote 2,000 pages. And HarperCollins got back to him and said, look, we've only got room for 850 pages. So he basically spent several months just going through every sentence and just trimming and trimming and trimming, and he eventually got it down. He might have had to get rid of a few stories and incidents throughout his long political career, but nevertheless, he felt the process made the book a lot better. You know, and you have to think, Margaret Thatcher, for example, wrote 2 volumes of her memoirs, and they are pretty turgid after a while. You know, all she needed was a good editor to say, we can get all of this in one book. I know it's easier said than done, but the whole process is like, you might find your original draft will be 2,000 words. 2,000 words. I do this all the time. And I'll spend the best part of a day just trimming and trimming and trimming. And it's so easy to find the bits of fat to cut. Now, there are different ways of doing this. I mean, there are obviously some prominent columnists in Australia like Andrew Bolt. Some of you might be familiar with his television program on the Bolt Report. He writes for the Herald Sun in Melbourne. Now, and this is not a criticism of Andrew, although for the purpose of this class it probably will be interpreted as one. He's incapable of understatement. I think sometimes it helps your argument if you make a concession here and there. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging some qualifications. For example, I wrote this a few years ago, but critical of the Rudd government's, this is, say, you're writing this from a free market, conservative, Liberal Party perspective, if you like. Critical of the Rudd government's budget stimulus package in 2009, you could use the following type of words. True, this is the beginning of a sentence, to be sure, in fairness, and then you make your concession before you go on with your but. I think, you know, the general reader is a bit agnostic about these issues, and if they see that you're prepared to make a few concessions, especially when you're on weak ground, I think it helps elevate not only the tone of your argument, but also puts you in good stead when you come in for the killer swing. And this is the point, really. The willingness to concede a point will make it hard for others to characterise you as dogmatic, and is likely to make a favourable impression on the uncommitted readers. That's right. Now, Owen Harries is a friend and a mentor. He'd been in his early 80s. He's a long distinguished career at Oxford, and he was the editor of the National Interest political magazine. In Washington for about 20 years, he was Malcolm Fraser's right-hand man in the late 70s, early 1980s. I love this little extract because, especially with these blogs, I find this with the internet, there is so much vitriol on the internet, and there's so much impugning one's motives. And I think that the point that Harries is making here is so true in any kind of debate, whether it's an opinion debate or whether it's in a basic public debate on campus. Before impugning your opponent's motives or the school of thought you're taking issue with, say for argument's sake, you're taking issue with the climate skeptics. Well, you're not going to win a lot of intellectual brownie points by denouncing them as deniers or saying they're in the pocket of big oil, even if they may be legitimately impugned. Answer the arguments. That's the key rule of writing an opinion piece. Answer the arguments and don't deal with motives or the personal. After all, says Harry, motives are irrelevant to the soundness of an argument. Anything that is said by someone whose motives are suspect or bad could equally be well uttered by someone whose motives are impeccable, and an answer will be still required. Besides, motives are in any case notoriously difficult to establish in a convincing way. All this is not to suggest that discussion of motives has no place, but its place is not at the beginning but at the end, when the facts have been established and error exposed. And I think that was a really wise bit of advice about opinion writing. Now, I know your essay, and we'll talk about your essay about China, which is due in a few weeks. It's the first assignment for the semester, I believe. Enemies, you know, that's probably pushing it, but know the opposite school of thought. This is John Stuart Mill, the great Enlightenment liberal thinker. Always know the strengths, not just the weaknesses, but the strengths of the opposite school of thought. And I think, Mill says it best. He who knows only his own position knows little of that. Now bear that in mind. That means you'll need to spend some time reading the various authors of a certain school of thought and trying to understand their strengths. Don't just dismiss them. I had one student, I think it was about 2 years ago, a very bright student, but he sort of stuffed up in class. He said, Samuel Huntington, we're familiar with the Sam Huntington thesis on the clash of civilization. Oh, he's just a racist. Well, it's crude. You know, he's a distinguished Harvard political scientist. He's got an intellectual argument there. You may disagree with it, sure. Most scholars do, but don't just dismiss him as a racist. Understand his argument at its strength. Take particular care to understand the position of your adversary, and to understand it not in a caricature or superficial form, but at its strongest. For until you have rebutted it at its strongest, you have not rebutted it at all. This is a necessary condition both for developing your own position fully and attacking his or her successfully. I think when you're making your argument, it really it helps to sort of wrong foot and surprise the reader. So when you're quoting someone, it's almost inevitable that you'll be quoting someone who'd be naturally agreeing with your position. But when possible, try to quote a scholar or a journalist or a politician that you least expect it to come from. So for example, you're writing a piece about the Iraq War and the perils of the Bush, Blair, Howard invasion of Iraq in March 2003. I wouldn't quote John Pilger or Noam Chomsky. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the reader's going to say, well, okay, here we go. But if you quoted someone who's hopped off the bandwagon, so to speak, someone who has entertained serious second thoughts or doubts since the invasion, I think that would actually boost your argument quite substantially. So for example, in your China piece, when you're making the case against the engagement policies of every US administration since Richard Nixon, you might be supporting the policy of a containment policy. It would help to quote someone, a former official, a former scholar, a former journalist, who had previously taken that pro-engagement policy, but now recognises that the game is up and the strategy has changed, the balance of power has changed, and so you'd use his or her argument to help make your broader point. So when bolstering the authority of what you are saying by the use of quotation, you preference wherever possible the sources which are not identified with your case. If you can, quote someone who is considered unimpeachable by your opponents. This will not convince them, but it will embarrass them and impress the uncommitted. I think that's a fair point. Thus, if you are concerned to establish the Keynesian economics and deficit spending as the right path forward, you don't want to quote a socialist or a centre-left or a Labor politician, because that's what you'd expect. Quote someone on the other side, if you can follow them. Malcolm Fraser's a classic case. She's always often quoted by people on the ideological left to make their arguments. It's sort of overdone now because it's been so long since he's seen as a conservative, but you get the point. Evidence. Okay, well this is just a key point. Always provide examples which are often a powerful and persuasive way of bringing a point home. And this is before we get to the distinctions between essays and opinion pieces. In opinion writing, the author often takes sides on the major issues of politics and public policy. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, as I said to you initially, it's hard for some of you because, quite understandably, you're very young, you're in your late teens, early 20s, maybe you might be a little bit older. You're probably still learning about the different schools of thought and the different arguments, and you're a bit nervous about putting your toe in the deep end of the pool. But, you'll really grasp the central concepts in this course, I think, by really understanding all the different schools of thought. And the more you read, the more you will learn, and the more you will form an opinion. Now, of course, you could change your opinion by the end of the course. 5 years, I know when I did this course, or a version of this course, in the early 1990s, 20 years ago, I was a committed Wilsonian. Woodrow Wilson was my hero. And I subscribed to the so-called New World Order. And I believe that America had a special mission to promote democracy around the globe. This was all in fashion. A bit like Francis Fukuyama's End of History. I bought it, hook, line and sinker. And I subscribed to that view for a couple of years until I did a history course here, and I changed my views. But the point here is, you're not trying to establish a truth, because these issues are all open to interpretation. You're trying to convince the reader of a certain viewpoint. And you've got to be assertive. You don't want to sit on the fence in these pieces. You want to make an argument. The goal is always to try to inform on questions to which there is no ultimate truth. Sure, most opinion writers offer their opinions as something they believe in, but don't offer them as truth. They recognise that others may disagree, but see little value in equivocation. You can make a few qualifications from time to time, but in the end, from introduction to the conclusion, it's got to be clear what the argument is. Last year when I marked some essays, it was students trying to have a bob each way, and that's not the way you're going to impress. You've got to put forward a view. In stating your own views forcefully and coherently, you actually raise and sharpen the level of debate and knowledge. Okay? Just general principles about opinion writing.
Okay, so when we're looking at, when academics come to write an essay or a short research piece, what we're trying to do is normally answer a puzzle. What really gets, particularly political scientists, blood pumping, is the puzzle. Right? What I mean by a puzzle is something you wouldn't quite expect. So a puzzle would be, well, all the existing literature says that the United States ought to be winning in Afghanistan at the moment, yet they're not, and this is a puzzle why, and let's dig into it that way. All right? So it's normally a limitation with the existing literature, right? The existing theory, right? Something you wouldn't quite expect. And this is when you come time to, if you're going to go on to do honours, normally the first thing that your supervisor will ask you to do is to come up with a research question, and the research question is based around a puzzle. All right? So this is when we're looking for the hook. All right? So when you're looking at an academic essay, or you're looking at a book or a journal article, the very first line, sometimes the very first paragraph, is a hook. Right? It's going to reach out and grab the audience, pull them in and say, you cannot live another second of your life without continuing reading this boring old, dusty old book. Right? But how they get them to drag them in is through the puzzle. All right? So this is something weird that we're observing that the current literature doesn't really quite explain. Opinion pieces also have a hook. Yeah? But the hook is different in its nature. It's different because you're not always trying to, well, you're very rarely trying to understand a puzzle, in a theoretical puzzle. You're trying to, the book is often inspired by current events. So right now, this is going on in the world, and I'm going to tell you what you ought to do. Yes? This is what I think is going on. This is what I think the government should do. Right? So it's inspired by events, a hot topic, what's going on right now. So when it comes time for writing your opinion piece, yeah, you need to include a hook, and you need to include a hook when you come time to write an essay, any essays you can write, but the hook changes in nature. It's not a theoretical puzzle, it's a hot topic. Got it? Yep, not. Right. Definitions. All right. When you come time for writing your introduction, so right now we're talking all about introductions and the difference between an essay and an opinion piece. When you come time for writing your definitions in an academic essay for all your other classes, what you'll do is you'll normally explicitly state your definitions. Yeah? Containment means this. And for the purposes of this essay, I'm going to use Mearsheimer's definition of containment because he's the most prominent theoretician on this topic, and therefore it makes sense I'm using his definition. You'd write this stuff, right? This is what you're used to writing. When you're writing when you're including a definition in your opinion piece, two differences. This first is you don't always, or very rarely, do it explicitly. Yeah? For the purposes of this essay, I'm going to use this definition of containment. You don't normally do that. Yeah? It's normally implicit in your argument and in your writing. Yeah? And it's normally the common usage of the term. So when academics use definitions and they use their concepts, they're using a very precise technical way to mean something. Whereas when you're writing for an opinion piece, you're normally using it in a more colloquial fashion. One definition is, one example would be difference between war and warfare, right? Academics use the word war to mean something very specific, and they use the word warfare to also mean something which is completely different from war. They're very different things. Yeah, they're very different concepts, they mean completely different things. Whereas in your opinion piece, in colloquial, on the streets, down the pub, you normally use war and warfare more or less interchangeably, right? So for your opinion piece, you do that, right? When you're dealing with your definitions, do it in the most common accepted definition. Don't use it in the more technical way, right? Your position on your argument, normally it's your point of difference is more nuanced when it comes time to writing an academic essay. The reason for this is, one, you have more words, and you're normally trying to mark out a niche position in the literature because it's a saturated topic, and I'm going to mark out this piece of territory for myself. Yeah? It's normally far more nuanced. Whereas when you're doing an op-ed piece, your argument is simple and it's direct. Yes? Containment is right, containment is wrong, or your third position, containment is wrong, this is better. Yeah? You've really got one of three different positions you can mark out here. Yes, no, this is better. Right? Keep it direct, keep it simple. The roadmap. So when you're writing an academic essay, as you know, the first paragraph is normally the puzzle, the research question. Your second paragraph in your introduction is marking out your territory. This is going to be my argument. And the final paragraph of your introduction is always a roadmap. You know this. And for an academic essay, it's normally explicit. So this paper is going to be divided into 3 sections. Section 1 is going to do this, section 2 is going to do this, section 3 is going to do this, and this paper will conclude by blah. Right? There's normally a paragraph at the end of your introduction, yeah, which explicitly sets out your roadmap. Yeah? So, and you'll find this in books, you'll find this in journal articles, you'll find this in essays. The final paragraph of your introduction is your roadmap. Yeah? Nod. Thank you. For the roadmap, when you're looking at op-eds, it's normally more implicit. Yeah? You don't include that last paragraph in your introduction saying it's first going to do this, second going to do this, second. It's normally implicit in the argument. Yeah? This is wrong for 3 reasons, blah, blah, blah. Right? And that's implicit that, okay, from here on, the next, in the body, it's going to be broken into 3 different sections. Yeah? Because in your introduction, you've said that containment is wrong for 3 different reasons. So it's implicit. Yeah? The reader knows implicitly that the body is going to be divided into 3 different sections, but you haven't included a paragraph which has set it up in a more formal way. Pros in your introduction. We've already covered this. I've done a good job of emphasising this. When you come time to writing, don't use jargon, don't use technical language. It's just going to bore everybody and put everyone to sleep. Yeah? Use more non-technical language. Make sure that it's persuasive, make it punchy and pacey. Do you ever think? Alright, so then we come time for the body. The paragraphs, longer paragraphs for essays, short paragraphs for opinion pieces. That's not just a paragraph, that's also sentences. Keep the sentences short. Shorter the better. Okay, evidence. Normally when you're using evidence for your essay, once again you have more words to play with, so therefore you can employ more evidence to support your position. So each paragraph, first sentence of each paragraph is normally a statement, and you'll then normally include 3, 4, 5 pieces of evidence, mixture of data, of quotations, or anything you can muster in support of that position, and then your final sentence of that paragraph will be a concluding sentence, and that will be your essay paragraph. Right? When you're using evidence for opinion pieces, you're often using a similar type of evidence, but you're using less of it. That means that you want to make it better. Yeah? So whereas for your academic essay, you might be using everything that you can possibly get your hands on and shoving it in there in support of your position, you probably want to be more selective in your use of evidence when it comes time for the opinion piece. Alright? Author's voice. In your academic essay, it's normally weaker. Alright? You normally let the evidence speak for itself. In opinion pieces, you don't have time. You don't have time, so you have to be very sharp. I think this is right. Right? Your opponent. Normally when you're writing an academic essay, what you're playing is who you're playing against. The opponent you're playing against is the theory and the data. Okay? There's either a weakness in the theory, it doesn't cover everything that's supposed to cover. There are exceptions, and I'm going to point out the weaknesses in the theory. There are inconsistencies in the theory. It's supposed to be deductive, but it's not. There are holes in it. Or you play the data. There's something wrong with the analysis. It's out of date. It doesn't really show what you're trying to, the author claim it shows. In the opinion piece, you play the opposing arguments. All right? So the argument for containment is this. I'm going to argue against that. Right? Play the argument, not the theory. So you won't be playing against the theory of containment. Alright? You won't be playing, you're not arguing against the theory of containment, you're not arguing against the data that other academics have mustered in support of the theory, you're arguing against the policy, that position. Alright? Your opponent, who you're arguing against, is the argument and not the theory. Make sense? Yeah? Alright, and your conclusion. In both, you restate your overall argument when it comes time to writing the conclusion, but you do so in a less comprehensive way in the opinion piece. So you say, when you're summing up, state your argument again, but you don't then need to go through and say, well, this opinion piece has argued this, it's done this and done that and done this other thing, and isn't this great? Where you would normally in your academic essay. Right? So restate it. So in both your essay and your opinion piece, you do restate, but in your opinion piece, you don't have to do it as comprehensively. Content, once again, in your essay, you'll summarise all the theory and the data, whereas in the opinion piece, you normally only summarise and restate the argument. And finally, alright, so normally when you're writing an academic essay, in the conclusion, as you know, you normally point out areas for future research. Yep. Oh, this essay has done all this great stuff, but it still leaves some questions unanswered, and people can walk in my footsteps, and when they do so, they ought to do that and this and that. Right? That's how you normally sum up your academic essay. For opinion pieces, you don't do that. Alright? For your opinion piece, what you normally do is you just sum up the argument and then point to any policy implications. So the government ought to do that. Yeah? That's where you can start to get traction. Yeah? What do you want this opinion piece to do? Yeah? This comes back to the big picture. Yeah? How does this fit into the overall debate? What do you want to achieve? What do you want to change? What do you want to defend by writing this opinion piece in the first place? All right? That's how you finish it up. All right? Now, what we'll do now is I'm going to hand back over to Tom, and I'm just going to run through a quick example of an op-ed that Tom wrote, and just run through the parts.
This opinion piece was written about a year after the invasion of Iraq, and it's a classic sort of university op-ed style piece. The question would be, for example, assess the outcome, the Bush doctrine with respect to the Iraq War. You may recall in the 2008 election campaign, Sarah Palin, the Republican vice presidential candidate, was asked a question by the host of the ABC in America about did she support the Bush doctrine? I think she gave a Pauline Hanson type response, said, please explain. But there wasn't just one component of the Bush doctrine, which is what the tone of the question seems to suggest. There are really three major tenets of the Bush doctrine. The notion of preventive war, preemptive strikes, dealing with rogue regimes that have the capacity to develop WMD. The notion that democracy is an export commodity, regime change, in other words, that was the words used at the time. And then the third doctrine was the notion of unilateralism. So I thought that a year after the Iraq War, and it was at a time in April of 2004, when Fallujah, a Sunni-held town, went up in smoke, and there were several Shia uprisings throughout the country. It was a good time to have a look at the Bush doctrine. And it's really just a classic introduction. It now appears that the US effort to remake Iraq as a viable and peaceful democratic state is likely to end in failure. If indeed that happens, it will be tragic for those in Iraq who long for peace, order and liberty. That's not the kind of introduction you'd expect to read from, say, Noam Chomsky or John Pilger. They would gloat about the problems that America's having in Iraq. So the tone, I think, needs to be about right. For the United States, it will involve a certain amount of humiliation, but it is to be hoped It'll also involve the destruction of 3 dangerous illusions that warped US foreign policy in the post-9/11 era. Basically, what I did then was look at the 3 major tenets of the Bush Doctrine. And dealing with the first one, summarising briefly what the central tenet was, which is essentially, preemption works against rogue states that are developing WMD. Containment, deterrence is a thing of the past. You may recall in that movie by Oliver Stone called W, there's a famous scene which is based on reality, where President Bush says to his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, containment no longer holds water in the post-9/11 era. And this was not just the neoconservative view, although it was widely held by neoconservatives, but even by a lot of liberals. Anyway, a nice succinct summary of that central tenet before 3 punchy paragraphs just pointing out why the argument, according to the author, has been proved wrong. And why containment could have worked against Saddam Hussein even if he was developing weapons because it would keep him in his box. Second point, same strategy. 1, 2, 3. This is the second point. Another prominent view was the idea that democracy is an export commodity. Again, widely held among not just neoconservatives on the right, but also a lot of liberal hawks on the left. And you explain what the argument is, a bit like Francis Fukuyama, a nice succinct summary. But then you have 2 paragraphs explaining why it just couldn't work to an arbitrarily created state, an ethnically and tribally divided society like Iraq. Historical examples are always good if you can find them, because most of the neocons and liberal hawks were making the point that it could work very well in Germany, and West Germany and Japan following World War II, which is true, but you have to acknowledge what the differences are between Germany and Japan and, say, Iraq in 2003, which we do there. Again, third point, you summarise briefly one of the major tenets of the doctrine, which is this notion of unilateralism. And this notion of empire and imperialism, which became such a prominent terminology. Usually it was a term of abuse in academic circles. Noam Chomsky, for example, would often throw around the term empire as a way of criticising his opponents. But in this case, the logical connection to unilateralism is empire, and there was a famous quote, I think it must have been after I wrote this piece, but it was one of President Bush's senior advisors, saying that we, meaning America, are an empire now, and we can create our own reality. And you might have read that in some of your articles in your reading list. A great quote. That would have been perfect for that. But then you point out why you disagree with that school of thought, and you make the point about the Sunni and the Shia uniting against the alien occupier. And then a short, sharp conclusion. British historian A.J.P. Taylor said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Again, sympathising with the subject. You're not just putting the boot into President Bush as the Iraq adventure is failing. A well-intended pledge to change the world. However, it's not in America's competence or interest. This is the policy implications that Adam was referring to. Of course, if you had more room, this was 750 words. It's all I had room for. It's a short, sharp piece. You can make the case for, the Bush senior policy of containment against these regimes and the notion of trying to work within the United Nations. But that's pretty much implicit in the piece. And that's a short, sharp piece. I think it's well structured for our purposes because it takes seriously the major tenets of the school of thought you're taking issue with, and then you rebut those schools of thought. So I hope that helps. Of course, not every opinion piece has to be structurally written like that. The magazine I edit these days, The Spectator, is a quirkier, wittier, irreverent magazine based in London, and they have a different style of writing. But I think for the purposes of your op-eds here at university, that's a good role model, I think. Now, do we want to talk about the China op-ed? Or?
Yeah, go next slide. And
No.
yep, that's it. So, what I might do is, while we've got Tom here, is just to discuss this question very briefly, and then you can have free rein to ask Tom any questions you have about writing op-eds or about the process of the opinion pages itself. So, the idea behind this topic is to put out a more provocative position when it comes to the United States policy towards China. So, the idea is that your first op-ed is going to be broadly on how the United States should deal with the rise of China and what the future of the United States policy towards China ought to be. So that was going to be what the first op-ed was going to be about. So what I wanted to do is put out a pretty provocative position and have you guys then bounce off it. All right? So in terms, if we're thinking about the different policies, options now available to the United States to deal with the rise of China, to perhaps some would say manage the rise of China, containment is one of the more muscular policy options available. Right? So that's the reason why we chose containment itself. That doesn't mean that you must argue for containment. No, you don't have to. If you don't agree with containment, don't argue for it. If you say that containment would be dangerous, argue that. All right? Or you can mark out a third option. So you can either go with, yes, containment is good, containment is dangerous and bad, or a third option would be to mark out a third position and say, no, containment is a risky option. A far better option would be, say, engagement, perhaps limited containment, maybe pre-containment. You can then mark out a different position. Yeah? So you really have your three different options available to you in response to this question. But I think one of the big takeaways from Tom's presentation today is to know your enemy. All right? So before you're going to argue against it, know what it is. Yeah? And so I would go away and I would read as much of, say, Mearsheimer's work as you could find, and find out as much about the strengths of the containment policy before you then mark out your own position to that, yeah? Whichever way you decide to go. All right. So if you were to, so I'll just ask Tom a few questions. So if the Spectator or the Australian, if you were to send out a request for some leading thinkers in the field to respond to a statement like this, to respond to a question of whether or not the United States ought to pursue a containment strategy towards China, what sort of things would you be looking for in the responses you get in?
Well, first of all, I think it needs to be said that this argument about containment is very much a minority voice, especially in Australia. There's hardly any serious scholars or policymakers who subscribe to the notion that there should be containment policy, although intriguingly, the Chinese leadership, in response to the announcement in Darwin last November of this enhanced military cooperation between Washington and Canberra, did interpret it as containment. Okay? So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. The containment school of thought is the unorthodox argument in this debate. Although, as Adam points out, we were very lucky 18, 12, 20 months ago to be graced with the presence of Professor John Mearsheimer, who's one of the most distinguished professors of international relations at Chicago University. He's known, more recently, a provocative thesis called the Israel Lobby, but he's also known for another provocative thesis on containing China. And his argument is that it's just inevitable. The nature of power politics, realpolitik, dictates that the rise of a great power like China will inevitably lead to a coalition of states ganging up against that rising hegemon. And that coalition of states will be led by the United States. So I would strongly encourage you to get your head around Mearsheimer's arguments. I think also in the United States, unlike in Australia, there is increasingly more scholars and journalists who are coming out, and if they're not subscribing to the George Kennan containment argument towards the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1940s, they're certainly going in that direction. And the classic case in point is a scholar and a journalist named Robert Kagan, K-A-G-A-N. He's at Brookings Institute these days, a prolific writer of books. And during the mid to late 90s, this is going back a bit, but he wrote several articles on the case for containment. And he's a beautiful writer. He's actually classy opinion writer and came to Australia a few years ago. But he is pretty much a minority, although intriguingly, I did see that, and this gets back to the question that Adam asked, there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal Asia. There are 3 Wall Street Journals. There's the Wall Street Journal in the United States, there's one in Europe, and there's one in Asia. And this was just a few weeks ago. It published an editorial pegged to the diplomatic stoush between Washington and Beijing over how best to handle the Syria uprising. And it's called The Values Clash with China. Okay, so you can probably Google it. You may have to get a password to get into it, I'm not sure, but it's called The Values Clash with China. It's the Wall Street Journal Asia. And the issues that they raise, well, classic style, they're fair to their opponents. They take seriously the conventional wisdom in Washington since Richard Nixon's opening to China in 1972, policy of engagement. 40 years after Richard Nixon's historic trip, the grand bargain that underpinned the two nations' détente is breaking down. While Nixon sought to wrong-foot the Soviet Union, his successors pushed the relationship forward in the hope of changing China, the notion of engagement. Beijing continued to hold to its authoritarian ideology, but presidents from both parties, Democrats and Republicans, gambled that aiding the spread of economic freedom would eventually lead to political freedom. And the issues that the journal raises is saying, well, that's clearly not happening. China is still very much an authoritarian dictatorship. And not only that, it is starting to flex its muscles in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits, and is raising all sorts of doubts and concerns among its nearest neighbours. And then, of course, it talks about a classic example of North Korea. The fact that Beijing's food, energy, and military support for Pyongyang harms relations with the US, Japan, and South Korea. The threat from the north has caused all three to tighten their military alliances on China's doorstep. Yet Beijing considers the continued existence of this Stalinist regime in its interests. The party now has an aircraft carrier to project power around the region, and it is spending billions of dollars to spread its anti-democratic message through satellite television. And this is the conclusion, it's a classic conclusion on this very question you've been asked. Chinese officials often accuse their foreign critics of having a Cold War mentality. While the US never entirely trusted China, it also hasn't viewed it for decades as an ideological enemy to be fought on all fronts like the Soviet Union, a la George Kennedy. But if Beijing insists on pursuing the policy indicated by its support for Syria and other rogue nations, the US will have no choice but to more aggressively counter Chinese influence. If not a Cold War, a cool war is looming if China stays on its current antagonistic course. That's it. That's your piece.
Okay, so we've had about 20 minutes left. Are there questions for Tom? We don't have roving mics today, unfortunately. There was a blow-in. So are people going to go to Joe Boswick's lecture this afternoon? Do people know about Joe Boswick's lecture this afternoon? You should have all received an email about it. Yes? No? Well, there are still seats available if you'd like to go. Greg Hall, 4:30. He's an entrepreneur who's doing, whose factory is now designed to be ethical and paying his workers a decent wage, and he's doing great things. So if you want to go see Joe Boswick, he's in Great Hall at 4:30 this afternoon, and they've stolen, quite rudely, our handheld mics, so you have to yell out, unfortunately. Questions for Tom? Yeah.
Tom, you mentioned that opinion articles are intellectual ammunition and valuable ideas. My question is that, in your view, what is the best way to mobilise with intellectual ammunition and gather evidence for the development of your opinion piece?
The best way of gathering the intellectual ammunition?
And gathering evidence in order to develop your piece.
Well, the more you read, I mean, that's as simple as that. I mean, you've got to get your head around all the major schools of thought, and you've just got to cover your bases when you're making a strong criticism of that school of thought. You don't want to be put in a position where a letter to the editor or someone with whom you're debating comes back and just points out an obvious fact that you've missed. You want to cover all your bases and make sure you get your head around all the strengths of the countervailing schools of thought. Yeah.
How do you feel about opinions starting to replace investigative journalism, aggregative websites such as Huffington Post, drawing away from New York Times,
Very good question. There is an argument that objective journalism is a misnomer. It's a controversial argument, but there is a sound argument that objective journalism is a misnomer because every day, every decision, reporters and editors make subjective judgments. They have to decide what's news and how to interpret it. So, not surprisingly, I would argue the rise of, say, Fox News Channel, which is clearly, got a conservative bent. It's driven in large part because a certain segment of the American viewership have been repulsed by CBS, NBC, ABC, the major networks, and what they see is a sort of a liberal bias. And so this trend towards partisan journalism is increasingly happening. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a problem so long as it's obvious. I mean, Fox News, for example, has broken a lot of stories that hurt the Republican Party. The most famous case, of course, was in 2000 when it revealed the story about Governor George W. Bush, about a week before the 2000 election, had been quiet about his DOI charge from 25 years ago with John Newcombe, the Australian tennis player, and that really set him back and probably hurt him among some Christian conservatives. But I do think that it is a worry in the sense that you've got to wonder about all news cycles. I mean, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian could look at the same issue from a completely different perspective. Who's going to give you the most objective account? The critics of the Australian would say, well, they always toe right, ideologically, and the critics of the Herald would be saying the other way, that they go left. But as long as the viewer or the reader is informed, then that's not a huge problem, as long as there's a diversity of news outlets. But I do think it's a good question because I think that objective journalism, as we know it, is it's not such a big issue as it once was. I think it's largely driven by lack of trust in the news media and the rise of a lot of this talkback and partisan journalism. Yeah.
In terms of the evidence that we use, I'm a little unclear whether it should be an even mix between theorists and policymakers and journalists and opinion makers. And is it a problem? Is it creating too complex an argument for an op-ed to stick largely to theorists and then add a couple of kind of relevant popular quotes in, or how should we mix that up?
Well, I think all the folks you mentioned are credible sources. I mean, theorists, probably less so for an op-ed version, but look, Mearsheimer is a theorist and he's a distinguished academic, so I think he'd be perfectly plausible to use as a source. Absolutely. But you don't want to have too many quotes in your piece, because remember, it's only 750 to 900 words. I think you want to save a quote from a theorist or a policymaker or a scholar or a journalist for when it really bolsters the argument. I don't think you want to litter your piece with too many quotes from these people. It's essentially you embracing many of their arguments and you're using them to support your argument. Yeah. Oh, we've heard from you. Is anyone else? Yes?
What's your opinion on containing China?
I subscribe to the conventional wisdom. I think that the policy that both Australian and American governments have pursued since 1972, since Gough Whitlam in Australia and Richard Nixon in the United States, it's broadly been the right policy. I think China today is a far more progressive place than it was during Mao Zedong's era. And that is largely driven by this increased interaction between China and the outside world. I mean, China was a horrible place in the 60s under the Great Revolution, the Cultural Revolution. People massacred. You don't see that now. Now, there are human rights abuses and one should not downplay them. But in politics, scale matters. And I think according to Amnesty International, I can't remember the exact figures, but there are something like 5 to 10,000 political prisoners in China. Now that is horrible, but in a country of size of 1.3 billion people, that amounts to 0.000023% of the population. It's hardly a Soviet gulag or a Nazi concentration camp. That's not to downplay it. It's just to say that China has improved dramatically internally. And on the foreign policy front, well, my view is the same as Steve Walsh, who's one of John Mearsheimer's colleagues at Harvard, who's a realist, but he takes a slightly different view to John. He thinks that it's only natural that all great powers, as they rise, like the United States in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century, their definition of national interests will grow as their power increases. And the task is to accommodate that rise, but to do so in a very peaceful way that doesn't aggravate relations with neighbours. And on that note, I think, for what it's worth, this is going against the grain in Canberra, because when President Obama announced his enhanced military cooperation with Prime Minister Gillard last November, it was overwhelmingly well received. But China was very concerned, and Henry Kissinger, who of course played an instrumental role in opening up relations with China 4 years ago, has just dedicated a book on this very subject. And he makes the point that the danger is these kind of policies, although they're not meant to contain China, they could be interpreted as a form of encirclement and containment in Beijing, and that's how wars start. And we saw this with Germany and Britain in the early part of the 20th century. So I believe in engagement, and I think the general consensus has been right, but I'm not naive about China's human rights abuses either, but I think that you can't change China by banging it with a big iron fist. I think that's generally the view in Canberra and in Washington. But I think it's a good subject to doing. I wouldn't discourage any of you to take issue with the conventionalism. Because this issue of China's rise presents all sorts of incredible geopolitical opportunities for Australia. As most of you know, since 1901, Australia's foreign policy has pretty much been dependent on a great and powerful friend, as Robert Menzies put it. Britain in the first half of the 20th century, in the second half of the last 60 years, the United States. And of course, the rise of China means different things for Australia and America. For America, it's the rise of a potential geopolitical rival, but for Australia, it's a tremendously rewarding trade relationship. And so now Australia, especially if there is some tension in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits, needs to find a way of riding two horses simultaneously. And that's a very, very delicate diplomatic feat to accomplish. But the containment, my suspicion is that the containment argument will get more intellectual credibility and more popularity over the next 10 to 20 years, particularly in the United States. So it's a good subject to look at. Anyone else? Yeah.
Forgive my ignorance, you covered everything except perhaps a title, because your opinion piece had a title. Are we supposed to include one?
Yes. Yes. Short, sharp title, don't make it too long. You'll often find with your journal, long essays you'll read in academic articles, they often have these long articles. Long headlines. This, I would say, The Case for Containment by Joe Smith, or The Folly of Containment by Joe Smith, or The Case for Strategic Engagement with Beijing, something like that. Keep it simple. And you can even put a subheading on there as well. Subheading, like a nice sentence summary of your argument. Because that's what all the good opinion pages do. If you look at the Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald, they'll have a headline, and then next to it they'll have a nice, snappy, one-line sentence to summarise your argument. Anyone else? Yes, right at the back.
I'm concerned that op-ed pieces in the newspaper generally sort of reinforce the conventional wisdom, just slightly to the left, slightly to the right, basically the same status quo.
Yep.
Have you seen any examples of something a unique or fresh perspective making its way into mainstream newspapers?
Can't think at the top of my head, although when I was at the Financial Review in '98, at the time of Suharto's, the Indonesian dictator Suharto's fall, much to the chagrin of my editor, I started publishing a few articles making the case for liberating East Timor from Indonesia, which was very much a marginalised view at the time, because the policy of the Australian government over the previous 20 years was to engage Jakarta, not worry about these separatist movements in Aceh and in East Timor. My own view is that I supported the Australian government's position on accommodating Indonesia, but I thought it'd be a good idea to publish a few people on left and the right making that argument. And then lo and behold, within 18 months, there was a referendum in East Timor, supported by the United Nations, led by the Australians with a peacekeeping mission. And now Australia's independent. So I'm not saying those opinion pieces played a role in the independence of East Timor, but it was going against the grain, and I remember a lot of our readers and the editorial team were thinking, why are you causing all this mischief? Well, it's the appropriate time to run it. It's great to sometimes be brave and challenge the conventional wisdom even if you don't agree with it. But I can't think of any other specific examples. I mean, you know, the Australian newspaper where I worked for much of that post-9/11 period, we often got bragged for being sycophants for Bush and Howard and Blair. And Robert Mann, many of you may have read Robert Mann's essay in a quarterly essay several months ago, making the case for a media inquiry because what Bob Brown calls the hate media, that is the Australian, had an agenda. It was overwhelmingly pro-war. But if you look at the opinion pages during that period, there was a real ping-pong match between the Hawks and the Doves from, I think, June 2002, as Americans in the world started debating the wisdom of war, right through to the invasion in March 2003. The Australian newspaper had a pretty even spread. I've got the figure somewhere, it's like 47-49 for and against. Whereas the Herald and the Age would have run overwhelmingly dovish anti-war pieces, which reflected probably a lot of their readers, but was it fair? Especially when the government of the day was supporting the initiative. So I think, you know, a good opinion page will present both sides of the argument. Mind you, I think for what it's worth, the best opinion page in the world would be the Wall Street Journal. And that does tilt right ideologically, but they're very well argued pieces. If you ever get a chance, go to the Wall Street Journal, review and outlet section. That's their editorials. They're always sharply worded, clear, concise, punchy. They'll even have a joke now and again. They'll grab the reader. I mean, this editorial or leader, same thing, in the Wall Street Journal Asia is only 650 words. But you read it, it feels like it's 2,000 words because there's so much information jam-packed into that. Yeah.
I just wanted to, I don't need to get political or anything,
Yes.
but ask you a question on media objectivity in Australia at the moment, especially in light of, you know, Tina Reinhardt being the big shareholder in Fairfax now. Yeah, just your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I strongly suspect that Gina Reinhardt's politics are to the right of centre. I admire her putting her hand up because, not so much for the ideological reasons, but because she's prepared to put money into a dying industry. I mean, Fairfax, its share price has collapsed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. Advertising revenue has plummeted, the readership has declined, and my suspicion is that when Rupert Murdoch dies, I don't think the Australian will be around, and I don't think the Herald and the Age will be printed in newspapers in 10 to 20 years' time. I think this dramatic digital revolution will start to replace this, and it raises all sorts of questions about content. You know, do you get your news from some blog, or do you get it from a respected content provider? And if papers like the Sydney Morning Herald, I mean, we're seeing this more in America, it's more evident in the United States. A lot of big city towns, their newspapers are just being completely downsized or shut down. It's a real concern. And Rupert Murdoch, who admittedly employed me for many years, I'm not a sycophant for Murdoch, I don't agree with everything he's done throughout his long career, but nevertheless, I think even David Marr, one of his critics, would acknowledge that he's played a prominent role in helping prop up a dying industry, and Reinhardt's intervention, to the extent that it's real, will only help do that, I think, for the Herald. But it does raise questions about the editorial agenda of the Herald once she's in charge. Mind you, bear in mind, Conrad Black, the long-time Canadian media tycoon, well-known conservative who used to own the Spectator magazine, he owned Fairfax in the early 1990s, and Fairfax didn't become more conservative as a result of his being in the top job. I mean, I think there's sometimes the proprietors, their influence in editorial output is often overstated. And having worked at the Australian, I never saw any examples of Murdoch putting his hands on any of the copy. Now, you could argue that he was smart enough to employ people who thought like him to do his bidding, some truth to that perhaps, but I never got the sense that the Australian was always running his agenda. And I suspect it would be the same if Reinhardt increased her share at Fairfax. Yeah?
These are obviously serious issues, but if we can find a way to express ourselves in like a witty manner.
In a witty manner?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that something that you would...
Well, I love that style of writing, but I'm not sure that's appropriate for the opinion page, for your essay. I think you want to be very careful there. I'd probably stick to that more serious tone that I try to do in that New York Times piece. But I think witty writing, if it's done well, and it makes people laugh, it's wonderful writing. because so much writing is so serious. I mean, it's so boring too a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And if you can make someone laugh, well, that's great. It makes you look at things from a different perspective. Definitely. I think the Brits, by the way, are much better writers generally, but they're very good with using humour to make a point. Yeah. I mean, whether it's the Guardian on the left or the Daily Telegraph or the Torygraph on the right, they do a very good job.
Okay, now, I know that after 2 weeks and 2 big weeks of talking about China, it's probably time to move on. We've had enough. So, there's been some, recently been some real big developments in Afghanistan.